Canadian colonel is sitting in the observer's seat of a slow, unarmed aeroplane crossing the German lines in northern France at a height where a man on the ground can hit you with a rifle. Below him is a long chalk ridge in the flat country behind it. Somewhere under that ground are more than 200 pieces of German artillery. He cannot see a single one of them. That is the entire point of the flight. The citation for the distinguished service order he was given for his work as counter-battery staff officer records it plainly. He crossed the enemy's lines in a low-flying airplane, and he came back with information about their batteries. It also records that he observed enemy guns from an exposed position under heavy fire more than once, and that he did it over a long period. Here is the part that does not fit. By the morning of April 9th, 1917, the office this man ran had identified every German battery position on Vimy Ridge except 3, not guessed at, listed, numbered, plotted, and handed to gun crews miles behind the line. And the men who found those positions had, for the most part, never once laid eyes on a German gun. So how do you find a thing you cannot see? And having found it, how do you hit it when nobody in the sector is allowed to fire a ranging shot that would give the whole plan away? Here is what I can tell you before we start. The man in that airplane was 30 years old. He was not a professional soldier. He was an engineer from McGill, in uniform for less than 3 years. And 8 weeks earlier, he had never done this job in his life. Neither had anybody else in the Canadian Corps, because the job itself had only just been invented. He had 3 assistants. Vimy Ridge, northern France, February 1917. Part 1. Start with a piece of paper because the paper explains everything that follows. The British Army's Field Service Regulations of 1909 were the rule book. Every principle of how the Army fought lived in that volume, and it had almost nothing to say about firing at the enemy's guns. It offers the idea in passing as a possible task for howitzers and heavy pieces, and moves on. Field Artillery Training, the 1914 manual, gives the subject a little more room and then delivers a sentence that decided how thousands of men would die. Gunners were to engage the enemy's batteries only where those batteries could actually be located and were actually holding up the infantry. Read that again and notice what it assumes. It assumes you can see the gun. In August 1914, that assumption was reasonable. The British Expeditionary Force went to France with 504 pieces, and at Mons, they often sat more or less alongside the infantry, firing shrapnel over open sights at men they could look at. 4 years later, the same army had 6,406 in the field, 2,204 of them heavy. Somewhere in between, the guns went underground, and the manual did not. A Royal Engineer ranging section arrived in France in November 1914 to work on the problem. At the start of 1915, it had a strength of 19 men. 19. Their method that first winter sounds invented and is not. Airplanes had no wireless sets, so a pilot who spotted a German battery flew over it and dropped a smoke bomb. Ground observers took bearings on the smoke, and where the bearings crossed, that was your gun. To get a range from a flash, you needed the height difference between yourself and the target, and the maps were not good enough to tell you. So they timed the gap between flash and bang, which put the battery inside an area rather than on a point. I have read a fair amount of the paperwork the British artillery generated in those first 2 years. What is striking is not that the methods were crude. It is that the crudeness was nobody's job to fix. There was no officer anywhere in the chain whose name was against the problem. You can watch what that costs. At Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, one British battery was allotted 32 shells a day to suppress 35 German batteries. 32 shells, 35 batteries. The arithmetic does not need finishing. The pattern repeats through the year. Aubers Ridge, Festubert, Loos, infantry crossing open ground while German gunners who had never been touched fired into them at their leisure. And the infantry, understandably, made it worse. The regulation said fire should go against whatever mattered most to the infantry at that moment. And what mattered most to a battalion was the wire in front of it. So the guns shot at wire. The thing that would actually kill those men once they were in the open sat in the depth of the position untouched, because it was invisible and because nobody had been told to make it their business. Then the Somme. The preliminary bombardment ran 7 days and fired something like 1.5 million rounds. British observers spotted 171 German batteries in action during that week. They knew where a great many of them were. Serious fire against them did not begin until June 30th, the day before the attack. On July 1st, the German artillery, largely intact, dropped its defensive barrage into no man's land on schedule, and by nightfall, 19,240 British soldiers were dead, and another 35,493 wounded. Picture that. The largest bombardment in the history of the British Empire, to that date, a week of it, and the guns that were going to do the killing had been watched for 7 days and left alone for 6. Now hold that failure against the ground this story is set on, because Vimy Ridge is the problem in its purest form. The ridge runs about 7 miles north to south, rising gently from the west and dropping away sharply on the east. That shape is the whole difficulty. Stand on the British side and you're looking up a slope. Everything beyond the crest is hidden. The Germans had held it since October 1914 and had put their batteries where the geometry told them to. Behind the crest, on the reverse slope and in the villages beyond, in pits, under camouflage, with the ridge itself acting as a wall between the gun and every pair of British eyes on the ground. So when the title of this story says, "Artillery Nobody Could See," it is not a figure of speech. On that ground, in the spring of 1917, an observer at the front line could not see the German guns. An observer behind the line could not see them, and a man in a balloon could see, at best, the roofs of the villages they were hiding in. The only 2 things on that battlefield that could tell you where they were had not been born as weapons at all. One came out of a Nobel laureate's physics. The other came out of a lamp that would not light. Now, here is the thing the story usually skips, and it matters for everything that comes afterwards. The men running the British artillery were not fools, and they did not need the lesson twice. Second Army saw the shape of it in October 1915, when its commander ordered that finding the enemy's guns stop being everybody's hobby and become one officer's duty. That officer was to be called the Artillery Intelligence Officer, and he was to sit with the heavy artillery groups. A dry administrative sentence and the beginning of the whole thing. In May 1916, on the Fourth Army front, Major General C.E.D. Budworth went further. He instructed a Royal Garrison artillery officer named Alan Gordon Haig, a professional South Africa and the northwest frontier behind him, to build a special organization for one purpose: to collect everything that could be learned about the German guns and to write the schemes for killing them. Haig did it, and he established the habits everything later would run on: work with the Flying Corps, keep obsessive records, study the photographs properly, shoot at the enemy's batteries every day, whether an attack is coming or not. One historian calls him the father of the counter-battery staff, and the description is fair. And after the Somme, General Headquarters made it universal. Every corps in the British Expeditionary Force would have an office for this. A lieutenant colonel at the head of it, a staff captain, clerks, orderlies, and the corps intelligence officers effectively folded in. In February 1917, GHQ printed the pamphlet telling everyone how to run it, and its opening lines are the sound of an army correcting itself. The work is not a matter of spasmodic effort. It is continuous. It depends on accuracy, on continuity of plan, on unremitting study and firm control. So the idea that shooting at the other side's guns is as old as cannon, and that there was therefore nothing to perfect, dies here. In 1914, the British Army had, in writing, no method, no doctrine, and no man responsible. By the winter of 1916, it had built all 3 from nothing in about 18 months and paid for the delay in a currency I do not need to name. The gunners had a nickname for the officers who filled the new posts. They called them the counterblasters. For 100 years, this has been told as a story of Canadian invention. A young engineer arrives, thinks scientifically where the British thought conventionally, and hands his country a victory. I read the record differently, and I do not think it takes anything away from the Canadians to say so. I think it makes what they actually did far more interesting. Nothing in that paragraph is Canadian. The office was British, the pamphlet was British, the instruments were British and French, and the Canadian Corps was handed a finished system somebody else had designed at almost exactly the moment it was finished. which means the interesting question is not who invented the machinery. It is why, when every corps on that front got the same office, the same pamphlet, and the same sections of Royal Engineers in the same season, one of them ended up with a reputation the others never got. A reputation so specific that in January 1919, an American artillery officer would write to a Canadian colonel asking for the paperwork on the grounds that there was nowhere in the Allied armies where this work was done so well, which raises the obvious question, and it is a fair one. If London wrote the manual and the Royal Engineers built the machines and every corps on the front got the same office on the same day, what precisely is left for a Canadian to perfect? Something specific and something measurable. But to see it, you first have to understand what those machines actually did, because they are stranger than their reputation. One worked by listening to air being pushed sideways. The other worked because a Canadian officer spent 4 days of his leave in a London back street buying electrical parts with his own money. Part 2. Mont Kemmel, Belgian Flanders, autumn 1915. A hill 400 feet high looking east at the German positions on the Messines Ridge. On top of it, in a hut, is a 25-year-old lieutenant of the Royal Horse Artillery whose battery has been laid up and who has therefore been given, in the phrasing of the period, general duties. His name is William Lawrence Bragg. Earlier that year, he and his father shared the Nobel Prize in physics. He knows very little about horses. His establishment is a mathematician, an electrician, an instrument maker, and 5 other men. His apparatus comes from Paris, from a laboratory run by Lucien Bull, and it was not built for war. Bull designed it to record heartbeats. It hangs fine strings in a magnetic field and photographs the way they twitch alongside a timing trace, so it can measure fractions of a second and write them down. The theory is beautiful, and at this point, useless. When a gun fires, 2 different things travel outwards. The shell, faster than sound, drags a sharp crack behind it. The gun itself makes a low thud, down at 10 to 25 cycles a second, more felt than heard. Only the second tells you where the gun is. The microphones they had were carbon granule telephone mouthpieces built for speech, exquisitely sensitive to the crack and half-deaf to the thud. They also picked up rifle fire, lorries, soldiers swearing and dogs barking. Bragg could photograph all of it with great precision. It told him nothing. I have read a good deal about laboratory work done under military conditions. What is striking here is not that the equipment was wrong. It is how long a Nobel laureate sat on a hill in Flanders with it, before anybody senior thought to ask what he needed. The answer, when it came from a lavatory and a mouse. Bragg was billeted in a farmhouse whose privy had a hole open to the outside. Sitting there one day, he felt himself lifted slightly off the seat when a British gun fired nearby. Lifted, though he had heard nothing worth noticing. The pressure had come up the pipe. The gun wave was not a sound at all. It was a shove of air. Corporal William Sansom Tucker, a physics lecturer from London who had enlisted as a private, noticed the same thing from the other end. 2 mouse holes near his bed let in a draft of cold air every time a gun wave arrived. Tucker had spent years at Imperial College, studying how moving air cools a heated wire. He sent for platinum wire, stretched a fine strand across a small hole cut in a container, and ran a current through it to keep it hot. The container, at first, was an empty rum jar. Now the gun wave arrives, pushes air through the hole, cools the wire, and the wire's electrical resistance changes. On Bragg's film, there appears a clean, sharp break exactly where the thud was. While the shells crack, all high-frequency wobble, barely moves the wire at all. By September 1916, every sound-ranging section on the British front had them. So, 6 microphones, buried in a shallow curve 2 or 3 miles behind the front. A man in an advanced post nearer the line with a key in his hand. He hears a German gun, presses, and the film starts running. Run it continuously, and you would need miles of film a night. The wave crosses the microphones one after another, and the film records who heard it first, second, third, and by how much. Each pair of arrival times draws an invisible curve along which the gun must lie. Where the curves cross is your battery. 50 yards in the first detection, 25 once you have heard it a few times. It would also give you the caliber, the direction the piece was pointing, and corrections for your own shells. Flash spotting sounds like the simpler of the two. It is not. 3 observers on widely separated hills take a compass bearing on a gun flash, the bearings go back by telephone, and where the lines cross, you have your answer. On the Somme front in October 1915, the posts were named after London music halls, which tells you something about the men doing the naming. Further north, they took the names of the villages they sat in, Lavender for Laventi, Bulrush for Bully. Theodolites showed the observer an upside-down world, a poor way to hunt gun flashes at 3 in the morning, so they were replaced with a coast artillery sight carrying a spider's web graticule, black against the sky by day, lit at night by a small bulb wired through a resistance. Dim flash, turn the graticule down. Blinding flash, turn it up until all you see is the hard core, and take your bearing on that. But none of it was worth anything until somebody solved a problem so simple it is almost comic. 3 men, miles apart, in the dark, on a front where guns fire constantly, all report a flash. Are they looking at the same flash? In May 1916, a Canadian officer named Harold Hemming, a McGill graduate serving in the British Army, decided the answer was a telegraph key. Give each observer a key. When he sees a flash, he presses it, and a lamp lights at group headquarters. 3 lamps together, 1 flash. Hemming built it, and there was not enough current in the line to light the lamps. He wrote to Bragg. Bragg suggested a sensitive relay. Hemming went on leave, and this is the detail I keep returning to. He spent it in Lisle Street in London, off Leicester Square, buying 6 relays, 6 keys, and 6 buzzers with his own money, and came back to France after 4 days of a fortnight. His fellow officers thought he had lost his mind. He wired the thing up. It worked. And the General Post Office built flash and buzzer boards for every base on the front. Picture that. The synchronization of the whole British flash spotting system running on 6 relays, a subaltern carried back through Boulogne in his kit. By the war's end, some 4,000 officers and men on the British front had one duty only: finding the enemy's guns. So what did the Canadians do with it? The Canadian Corps opened its office on February 10, 1917, and Major General E.W.B. Morrison named Andrew McNaughton to run it. Brigadier General Percy Radcliffe, the Corps Chief of Staff, sent him to British Fleet Corps, whose reputation for this work was the best on the front, and there he met Alan Gordon Haig and was shown the map, a single master chart of every German battery in the sector, tracked, dated, updated daily. Haig had copied the idea from a German chart captured on the Somme, which plotted British gun positions with the same care, including those of the Howitzer Brigade McNaughton himself had commanded there. Then he built his own. His staff captain for operations was Nesbitt, a Royal Garrison artillery officer on loan from the British Army. His orderly officer was Napier, a barrister in civilian life, whom McNaughton later called absolutely 100% efficient. And a barrister is exactly who you want, keeping a register that has to survive being wrong. His intelligence officer was Davidson, a British officer whose wound had made him unfit for the line, who had gone to the Flying Corps to specialize in reading aerial photographs, and whose older brother held senior staff appointments at GHQ, a fact McNaughton used without embarrassment whenever he wanted something. And then they wrote down the rules. A German battery was not confirmed on 1 report. It was confirmed on 2, and the 2 had to come from entirely different sources: a sound-ranging fix and a photograph, a flash bearing and a prisoner statement, an intercepted signal and a forward observer. Everything confirmed went onto the hostile battery list with a permanent number of its own, and onto the battle map. Every day the office produced an intelligence report, a fresh list, and a program naming which battery each gun would engage. And every heavy artillery group had an officer whose job was to come back afterwards and say what the shells had actually accomplished, so the target could be struck off or shot at again. Not an invention, a discipline. A photograph, McNaughton said later, tells you nothing until you put a man on it who knows how to interpret what he sees. The office existed so that 2 independent men, working from 2 different kinds of evidence, had reached the same square on the same map before a shell was spent on it. At Vimy, aircraft adjusted the fire for 3/4 of every shoot it ordered. Harold Hemming does not appear in the Vimy story Canadian schoolchildren are taught, and neither do the men who sat in the church tower at Laventi taking bearings on flashes until the tower came down. If you think names like those are worth keeping in circulation, the like button is a small thing that does exactly that. There is a hole in everything you have just heard, and the Germans were about to fall into it alongside us. You now have a grid reference. A 6-figure number, correct to 25 yards for a gun you have never seen. A grid reference is not a hit. Part 3. The bombardment of Vimy Ridge opened on March 20th, 1917, and intensified on April 2nd. Something over 1 million rounds went onto that hillside in a fortnight, much of it wire-cutting with the new No. 106 fuse, which burst on contact instead of burying itself in the mud. The German garrison had a name for the last week of it, and the name survived: the Week of Suffering. At 5:30 on the morning of Easter Monday, April 9th, the guns lifted and the Canadian infantry stood up. Now the numbers, exactly as the office recorded them, because the version in general circulation is not what the record says. On the morning of the attack, every German battery position on the ridge had been identified except 3, and Davidson, reading the evidence afterwards, concluded those 3 had stayed silent throughout. At 0 hour, the heavy guns put neutralizing fire onto 47 batteries. You will have heard a figure attached to this battle: 83%. It is in the books, on the plaques, in the documentaries, and it is usually given as the proportion of the German artillery destroyed before the infantry moved. That is not what McNaughton's report says. In his notes, compiled in the weeks after, the figure measures how good the intelligence had been. Of the 47 batteries engaged at 0 hour, 83% turned out to have been genuinely active. The office had spent its opening fire well. The same report contains the other half of the audit, and nobody quotes it. Of the 34 positions the staff had assessed as inactive and therefore left alone, 18% opened fire during the battle. The Sound Rangers had correctly established the caliber and arc of fire of 65% of the pieces at the ridge, a remarkable result, and also a third they had wrong. The 60-pounders were judged too weak to break the German emplacements. And the first recommendation McNaughton made after the most celebrated victory in Canadian military history was that somebody please give him more clerks. The Canadian Corps took 10,602 casualties on that ridge. 3,598 of those men died. I have gone through a fair number of after-action reports from that period. What is striking about this one is not that it found problems. It is that it went looking for them days after a victory the rest of the empire was busy calling flawless, and then put the failures on paper where superiors could read them. Because the German guns at Vimy were not destroyed. They were reduced, harassed, and made to work in respirators, and enough survived to kill 3,500 Canadians in 3 days on a front where almost every one of them had been found in advance. The next 2 years are the story of an office trying to close that gap, and the first thing that happens is that it gets worse. In June 1917 at Messines, the British tried something clever. Before the main attack, they put in a false one, purely to provoke the German artillery into firing so the locators could take fixes on it. Afterwards, the count showed the Sound Rangers had accurately located over 93% of the German battery positions on that front, the best result anyone had achieved, and the high water mark, because the Germans were not idle. They stopped trying to protect their guns and started hiding them. Alternative positions, so a battery could fire from one pit and sleep in another. Dummy flashes, to give the observers something to triangulate that was not there. Wandering guns. Single pieces moved constantly, firing a few rounds from a place nobody had listed and then leaving. Positions changed so fast, the hostile battery lists went stale faster than they could be typed. In the flat country round Ypres, where the observation posts had nothing to stand on, British gun hunting fell away from what it had been. Then, Hill 70, August 1917, where the Canadians got it right and got hurt at the same time. Arthur Currie had just taken over the Corps. Ordered to take Lens, he proposed instead to take the high ground north of it and let the Germans destroy themselves counterattacking uphill. McNaughton was given 111 heavy guns, from 60-pounders to 9.2-inch howitzers, with a 15-inch and 4 12-inch howitzers on call. He was also given gas, 7,000 rounds to the 60-pounders, and 8,000 to the 4.5-inch howitzers, most of it for the enemy's batteries. That allocation is worth pausing on because it is the first sign of the idea that eventually solves everything. A gas shell does not have to hit a gun. It only has to land near enough that the crew put on box respirators. And a man in a box respirator cannot easily raid a range table, check a sight, or shout an order. You have not destroyed the battery. You have made it slow and stupid for as long as the gas hangs about. By 0 hour on August 15th, 63 of the 102 German batteries facing the Corps were out of action. But the number that tells you it worked is a line in the report of the 8th Canadian Infantry Battalion. Of 400 casualties that day, 70% came from small arms fire. In a war where shell fire caused most of the severe wounds, that ratio is an obituary for the German artillery on that hill. MacNaughton described the affair to the British official historian in 4 words: a killing by artillery. But look at the other column of the ledger. On the night of 14th to 15th August, German gas fire on the Canadian heavy batteries almost completely neutralized them. Same weapon, same night, the other way round, and then Passchendaele, which broke it. The Corps went to Flanders in October 1917, and everything the system needed was missing: ground that swallowed guns, planning cycles too short to build a target list, worn barrels, and records inherited from the formation it relieved that were so poor MacNaughton complained he could not compare 1 week's intelligence with the week before. The locating sections could not keep up with the front, so almost everything came from the air, and the weather over Flanders that autumn was what it was. MacNaughton said afterwards that orders were being given to fire ammunition that was never in fact being fired. Read what the Corps artillery report concluded about that battle. It did not credit the gun hunting with the success of the operations. It credited the infantry with forming up positions just clear of the places the Germans habitually shelled. That is a staff officer writing, in an official document, that his own branch was not the reason his side won. So what does an office do after that? It measures. That is the whole answer, and it is stranger in practice than it sounds. MacNaughton went to an observation post and sent the same message back to his headquarters twice. Once by carrier pigeon, once by wireless. The pigeon arrived in half an hour. The wireless message arrived the following day. In July 1918, the staff tested whether a steel helmet and a box respirator threw off a prismatic compass. They did, by as much as 10 degrees, which meant every bearing taken by a man in a gas mask had been quietly wrong. The recommendation: stop carrying the respirator on the chest. Keep it at the side. Look at what the first result actually is. The most advanced fire control organization on the Western Front, and the fastest way to get word from an observation post back to the guns, is a bird. And out of Passchendaele came the recommendation that changed the architecture. The Canadians said the locating section sat too far back and answered to the wrong people. They belonged to the gunners, not the intelligence branch. GHQ agreed, and the flash spotters and sound rangers went under the Royal Artillery for tactical purposes. The men who found the guns and the men who fired at them were finally in one chain of command. The usual reading of Vimy is that Canadians were quicker than the British to adopt science, and I do not think the record supports it. The British invented every instrument in this story and wrote the doctrine for using them. What separates the Canadian Corps in the files is duller and much rarer. After every battle, win or lose, somebody sat down and wrote out precisely how badly it had gone, in numbers, and sent it to people who could act. Vimy produced a list of complaints. Hill 70 produced a gas doctrine. Passchendaele changed the command structure of the entire British locating service. Genius is not the word for that. Nerve is the nerve to be the officer who states, on paper, that the celebrated victory had a 35% error rate in it, which is where we have to stop looking at our own side. The Germans had a physicist too, and a general who wrote an order about British microphones, and by the spring of 1918 they had built their own version of all of this, and used it to hit us harder than we had ever hit them. Part 4. There is an order issued in 1917 over the signature of the man effectively running the German war effort that tells you exactly how well the Germans understood what was being done to them. Erich Ludendorff informed his armies that the English had a well-developed system of locating guns by sound, and that precautions were to be taken accordingly. Register when the wind is against them. Fire many batteries at once, so the traces overlap and nothing can be separated out. Fire simultaneously from false positions. He also wanted a set of the British apparatus captured and brought to him. Read that as an admission, and it is remarkable. The German High Command was ordering its gunners to change how, when, and from where they fired, because of 6 buried microphones in a strip of photographic film. So why did the Germans never build their own? They tried. His name was Lugger Mintrop, a mining engineer and seismologist who had spent his career listening to the ground. From 1914, he went to the General Staff repeatedly with the same proposal. Portable seismographs, placed in a pattern, could fix an enemy gun quickly and accurately. He got nowhere for 2 years. Only after the Somme did anyone in Berlin become interested enough to let him prove it, and towards the end of 1916 he was given a demonstration at the Vaughan artillery range. He located the pretend enemy battery so precisely that Ludendorff approved 100 locating crews and wanted them in the field during 1917. Then nothing much happened. Qualified men were scarce. Materials were scarce. The instruments were built slowly and never in the numbers ordered, and Mintrop's organization ended the war a minor curiosity in a country that had approved it at the highest level. The German seismic gun location program, personally authorized by Ludendorff at 100 crews, is one engineer in a workshop who cannot get enough steel and wire. The British had 4,000 men doing that job full time. Now, none of that means the Germans were beaten in this fight. In one respect, they beat us badly, and the winter of 1917 is where it starts. At Cambrai, on November 20th, 1917, the British did something no army had done. They attacked with the entire artillery program predicted. No preliminary registration at all, because registration is a letter of the warning addressed to the enemy. Every heavy and siege battery surveyed in and given a bearing picket. 90% of the German batteries correctly located beforehand, nearly all by the locating sections. Mobile detachments went forward with the advance, and one base was working 56 hours after zero. Then the German counterattack came through, and somewhere behind the lines, a section of the most secret apparatus on the front was thrown into a pond so it would not be captured. The Germans took the lesson. A captain named Erich Polkowski had worked out the mathematics for firing without registering, and it is the mirror image of everything the Canadians had been doing. Measure each gun tube's own velocity error, the Germans called these the special influences, and do the measuring in a rear area where nobody can watch. Then combine those figures algebraically with the day's weather, temperature, wind, air density, the daily influences. Colonel Georg Bruckmüller became the method's great advocate, and on March 21st, 1918, the German bombardment that opened Operation Michael fired 3.5 million shells in 5 hours, close to 200 a second, and one man saw it coming and said so out loud to the commander-in-chief. In March 1918, Field Marshal Haig visited the headquarters of 6th Corps and walked into the artillery office. Harold Hemming was there, the same Hemming, now the Corps reconnaissance officer still hunting guns. Haig asked him whether the Germans could attack tomorrow. Hemming said he did not think they could. Haig asked why not, and Hemming answered with arithmetic, "At Ypres we had 1 gun to every 3 yards of front, and the enemy will want more than that, and I have found only 1/3 of what he needs, though more have just moved in." Haig told him to send a telegram as soon as he had found half the missing batteries. Hemming sent the telegram on March 18th. The offensive began on the 21st. When it came, the locating system on that front simply ceased to exist. The telephone lines were cut and nothing could be fixed. The apparatus had to be got away rather than captured, and each post owned one 2-wheeled cart, so a great deal was abandoned or destroyed. Some of the locators were taken prisoner. Others were handed rifles and put into scratch defense parties, digging trenches as infantry. Men who had spent 3 years measuring hundredths of a second given a shovel. By May, Bragg and Hemming were both back at work, surveying gun positions for the GHQ defense line, the last prepared position the British had. And yet, look at what those same sections managed in the middle of the collapse. In March 1918, the month the front came apart. One field survey company alone logged 1,017 battery locations by flash spotting and 2,125 by sound ranging, the highest monthly figures it recorded in the entire war. The system was being overrun, and it was working harder than it ever had. So, the Germans caught up, used the method better than anyone had used it, and nearly won the war with it in 5 weeks. Which brings us to a document the Canadians wrote about themselves in the 7th week of that summer. In June 1918, the office ran a study on how accurate its own shooting actually was. Every type of gun in the Corps fired at 3 kinds of target: a 50-yard by 10-yard strip representing a battery seen end-on, the same strip seen from the front, and a 10-yard square representing a dugout or a cable junction. The results are on paper, and they are brutal. Out of every 100 rounds fired by prediction, no ranging shots, everything computed from the map, the calibration, and the weather, between 0.2 of 1 round and 1.5 rounds landed inside the target. The report states flatly that the errors introduced in map shooting are very large. It also found that firing at a battery end-on, which every gunner in Europe believed was the better way, offered no discernible advantage at all. Sit with that number. 1.5 hits per 100 shells on a good day against a target you had spent 4 months finding. And before anyone assumes this was a limitation of primitive equipment that later generations solved, when British scientists ran the same test in February 1945, during the Rhineland fighting, with a further quarter-century of gunnery behind them, they found 5% of predicted rounds landing inside a 100-yard square. Better, not different in kind. Predicted fire is almost always presented as precision restored to the battlefield, the moment the guns became surgical. I read that document the other way round. It is a demonstration that precision was never available and that the Canadian Corps knew it a full 7 weeks before the greatest artillery operation it would ever mount. Which means the thing everyone praises them for is not the thing they were actually doing. They were not trying to hit German guns. They were trying to make a rectangle of ground so unsurvivable that whether any individual shell hit anything stopped being relevant. 2 batteries onto every hostile battery. High explosive mixed with gas, delivered in the 90 seconds when the infantry was climbing out. You cannot aim your way out of a 1% hit rate. You can only drown it. There is one more German document worth putting on the table. In October 1918, a British reconnaissance officer reported on a captured German counter-battery map. It plotted 600 British gun positions. Against those 600, the Germans had carried out 22 engagements. I have read a fair amount about the German artillery in the last year of the war. What is striking is not that they had failed to find our guns. It is that they had found them, drawn them, filed them, and no longer had the shells to do anything about it. So here is where I put my cards down, and I know it is not the usual reading. I do not think the 83% figure everyone quotes about Vimy means what it is used to mean, and I think the Canadian Corps' real achievement is hidden by it. If you have seen the original documents and read them differently, the comments are the place for that. And say what you're basing it on, because I would rather argue with the citation than with the slogan. Because everything so far has been a system with time on its hands. Vimy had 3 weeks of bombardment, 4 months of intelligence, and 1 million shells. In the summer of 1918, the Corps was handed a week, a strange sector it had never seen, and an order forbidding it to fire a single ranging shot. Part 5. At the end of July 1918, the Canadian Corps was told to move south to the Amiens front, and to do it without anyone finding out. The secrecy reached individual soldiers. A notice pasted into paybooks told men that the success of any operation depends chiefly on surprise, that they were not to discuss preparations with other units or with strangers, and, the phrase that stayed with the ones who wrote about it, to keep their mouths shut, especially in public. Now look at that from inside the counter-battery office. Everything that had worked at Vimy required time and a settled front, 4 months of watching. Sound-ranging bases that took a fortnight to install because the lines had to be laid. Photographs flown, printed, read, cross-checked, argued over. Registration shoots to prove the guns were laid correctly. At Amiens, MacNaughton had none of it. His corps reached a sector it had never seen about a week before the attack, and nobody was permitted to register a single gun, because one ranging shot from an unfamiliar position would have told the German intelligence staff everything. The Australian Corps, handing over the ground, gave him every scrap they had on the German batteries, which was decent of them and was still somebody else's homework. He had also just proved in his own June study that the fire he was about to order would miss. So he did the only thing the arithmetic allowed. Instead of one battery against each German battery, he massed at least 2 onto every hostile position on the list and mixed gas into the program. In a letter to his wife, he described the intention in one word: swamp, 4:20 in the morning, August 8, 1918. Thick fog on the Santerre Plateau. Across Fourth Army, the artillery timetable put fire onto 504 of the 530 known German guns at 0 hour, and the field guns walked a barrage forward in front of the infantry and the tanks. Some German batteries did get their defensive fire away. Within 2 hours, it had almost entirely stopped. Not because every gun had been hit, but because Canadian infantry were standing in the pits. The Corps advanced 8 miles that day and lost 1,036 men killed and 2,803 wounded, and Ludendorff, who had spent 2 years signing orders about British microphones, called it the Black Day of the German Army. Afterwards, the staff walked the captured positions and measured, because of course they did. What they found is the June study made flesh. The fall of shot around each German battery showed very wide dispersion, and the mean point of impact was on the target. The individual shells had gone everywhere. The center of gravity of 100 of them had gone exactly where the mathematics said. Call that marksmanship, if you like. What it is statistics, applied to a rectangle of French farmland at 4 in the morning. There is a second lesson working underneath Amiens, and it came from the French. In October 1917, the French attacked at La Malmaison, and their corps artillery commander, General Barbier, later lectured on it. GHQ sent an officer to take notes and circulated them across the British front in February 1918. One observation in those notes is the whole future of the war in a sentence. The Germans at Malmaison had considerable artillery strength they were unable to use, because the depth and speed of the attack forced a great many batteries to displace. A gun being towed is a gun not firing. You do not have to find it, hit it, or gas it. You only have to make the ground it stands on untenable fast enough that it spends the battle on the road. Through the 100 days, the Canadian penetrations were repeatedly deep enough to do exactly that, and German batteries that had never appeared on any list were abandoned in their pits or lost on the retreat. The Germans responded to Amiens by pulling their field artillery further back to keep it safe, which kept it safe, and put it out of range of the attacking infantry it existed to kill. By this point in the war, there was no good answer available to them, only 2 kinds of losing. Valenciennes, on November 1st, 1918, is where you can see the finished article, and it is almost anticlimactic. The Germans there had done the opposite of their usual practice and pushed their field guns forward to reach deeper into the Anglo-Canadian rear, which made them easier to find. There was no registration and there were no destruction chutes. Nobody thought them necessary any longer. The program against the German batteries opened 10 minutes before 0 at 5:15 in the morning. Aircraft and forward observers called for fire on anything the office had missed, and the infantry took the ground. 10 minutes. At Vimy, it had been 3 weeks. By that autumn, more than a quarter of all the heavy guns the British Army possessed were serving with the Canadian Corps, most of them British units under Canadian control, and MacNaughton's account of how that worked contains no drama. Coordination gave them no trouble because what was essential had been reduced to a drill. The locators had the worst of it in those final months. Sound-ranging bases took too long to lay out, and the front was moving faster than the wire, so MacNaughton cut the number of sections and gave the flash spotters wireless sets instead. You can watch the war change shape in one company's monthly returns. In September 1918, it located 1,230 hostile batteries by flash spotting and 434 by sound. A year earlier, the ratio had been the other way round. Some of those men died the autumn of Spanish influenza in the middle of the advance. So what actually survived all this? In January 1919, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Crerar, MacNaughton's protege and a man who would command the 1st Canadian Army in the next war, wrote up the organization and procedure of the Canadian Corps Counter-Battery Office and sent it to GHQ. MacNaughton wrote back that the information ought to be of great help in the study of the science before a future war. He meant it literally. He was writing a manual for a war he assumed was coming. On January 27, 1919, the headquarters of the American Third Army Corps in occupied Germany wrote to Crerar asking for a copy. The American officer gave his reason plainly. From all accounts, there was no place in the Allied armies where this work was so effective, and he hoped his own service could use it to perfect their organization. Later that year, the War Office adopted the Canadian Corps Artillery Staff structure, and the Royal Artillery was still using it in North Africa and Italy 24 years later. So, in one sentence, what the Canadians perfected was not a way of seeing. It was a way of being usefully wrong, a method for firing at a 6-figure number instead of at a target, with enough guns, enough gas, and enough honesty about the odds that missing by 50 yards stopped deciding anything. Almost every element of it was borrowed. The microphones were Tucker's, the recorder was Bull's, the mathematics was Bragg's, the buzzer board was Hemming's, the office was Budworth's and Haig's, the doctrine was GHQ's. What the Canadian Corps added was the audit. 2 independent sources before a battery went on the list, an officer sent back afterwards to report what the shells had really done, a study that told them their own accuracy was 1.5%, and the willingness to put all of it in writing and hand it to anyone who asked. As for the man in the airplane, Andrew MacNaughton finished the war at 31 as a brigadier general commanding the heavy artillery of the Canadian Corps. He became chief of the General Staff, then president of the National Research Council, and in the 1930s, he worked on the Cathode Ray Direction Finder, a Canadian forerunner of radar. The officer, who once flew low over the German lines hunting guns, he could not see spent the years before the next war building a machine to find aircraft nobody could see. He commanded the 1st Canadian Army, left that command in December 1943, served as Minister of National Defense, and died in 1966. The church at Leventi, destroyed in 1918, was rebuilt. The 4,000 men who did nothing in that war except hunt the enemy's guns are not named in any account most people will ever read. If this was worth your time, the like button is what puts it in front of the people who care whether the numbers in a story are the real ones. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there is one. The same argument, the same officers, and a fight in 1944 over whether science belongs anywhere near an operational headquarters. And if you take one thing from Vimy, let it not be the 83%. Let it be the man who won the most famous victory in his country's history and then sat down and wrote a report about everything he had got wrong.